Hello, my name is Alex, and I am the host of How Bizarre Podcast, and this is episode 7 of the series. Hopefully you'll like it, and the show will make some traction in the time ahead. So, what is this podcast about? It's about storytelling, and especially about stories that are obscure, unknown to the wider public, strange and sometimes inexplicable, content that somehow never got the attention it deserved, stories that are forgotten in the mists of time, regardless if they happened yesterday or some centuries ago. So if you are attracted to bizarre, shocking, or just plainly weird stuff, I think you'll find this podcast very informative, and perhaps even entertaining. Today's episode is named A Real Hero. Born in Sweden, Count Carl Gustaf von Rosen comes from high aristocracy, which makes his path in life a bit unusual, considering that the vast majority of people belong to a certain social class and socialize in the ways in which they perceive the world, and the goals they aspire to are defined by the group they are born into. An unusual life trajectory that started in a completely normal orbit. So unusual, that in the time we live in, I have no doubt that people would nod their heads in pity. It is not that people do not have ideals, or if they do, they are diluted like gasoline at local gas station. This is because people of today are jaded, and do not have a gyroscope in their mind, moral foundation around one could form an ideal. It all may have started with his father, inclined to take on the role of black sheep in the family, a researcher and pilot who donated his plane to the Finnish insurgents during the 1917 to 1919 War of Independence from Russia. A family with good connections and status, a relative of none other than Hermann Goering, who was the culprit for arousing little Karl's love of flying. That happened gradually, during the stay of Luftwaffe future Fat Commander at Karl's home and the stories of his quite real feats during the Great War. A living example of the duality of the whole world and the circumstances that govern it. If there was one, this was it. Fatty Herman setting the stage for events that would end up saving thousands of children. It does not matter whether he became a pilot before or after, but Karl had a need for predetermined battles, an imaginary identification with the chivalry of the past, and occasional outbursts of altruism, as it happened after the 1935 invasion of Ethiopia by fascist Italy. Reports speak of the Count as a Red Cross pilot, flying on food delivery missions and rescuing wounded civilians. Italians invaders, in the absence of an air adversary by the symbolic air force of Emperor Selassie, unleashed their anger on a number of planes of humanitarian organizations. So von Rosen did put his head in a bag many times, and was once poisoned in a chemical warfare attack at the airport where he was stationed. A few years after this adventure, he volunteered in defending Finland from the invading Soviet troops. Seeing how ill-equipped Finnish Air Force was, especially in need of bombers, he decided on improvising, which would become his trademark in the future. Having sufficient funds, both from family sources and from the salary as a pilot of the Dutch KLM company, he procured a used passenger Douglas D.C.2 plane, which he turns into a DIY bomber with an improvised bomb disposal rack and an optical sight. With it, he carries out numerous attacks on the aggressor forces, despite the unthinkably bad odds. After the Winter War ended, Karl applied to the RAF to fly as a volunteer against Luftwaffe in the Battle of Britain. He was prevented from doing so by the British intelligence service because of his family ties to Goering, underestimating the Count's honesty, as his wife died as a member of the Dutch resistance movement against the Germans and losing an incredibly strong propaganda opportunity. After the war, he returned to Ethiopia where his exploits were not forgotten, and he lived there for a decade, organizing the newly emerging Air Force in that country. The most controversial period of his life followed when his actions had global impact. During the civil war in the Belgian Congo, he flew as a personal pilot to UN Secretary General Dag Hammarskjöld, except on one date, when he reported ill, and left it to another pilot to transport Hammarskjöld. Coincidentally or not, it was the same flight when the Secretary General's plane was shot down and Hammarskjöld was assassinated, most likely by Belgian mercenaries. Leaving Congo during those controversial events, he remained off the radar for some time, and reappeared on the stage a few years later to make his own legend. The 1967 to 1970 Nigerian Civil War over the secession of the Igbo people from Nigeria and the creation of Biafra as an independent state. With the exception of Israel, France, and several neighboring countries, Biafra was blocked on all sides, and the United States, Soviet Union and Great Britain sided with the Nigerian central government and helped bring the runaway province back. Karl flew as a volunteer to deliver humanitarian aid to the victims of the blockade, to avert massive starvation. Biafra was the place where for the first time the world saw scenes of mass murder of children. With the advent of technology and personal cameras that became available to almost anyone, the daily contact with these children and their horrified gaze was something that moved the Count deeply. Childhoods extinguished by the interests of the bigger players on the world stage, and he did something other than an afternoon sigh over the injustices of the world. He hatched a plan. With a group of mercenary friends, a colorful gathering of ex-Luftwaffe aces, former South African pilots, Swedish adventurers and local tribal members who were interested in learning how to fly, Count von Rosen decided to go on the offensive. After failing to procure serious fighter jets on the international military surplus market, they managed to obtain few AT-6 Texans and A-26 Invaders as well as single B-25 Mitchell, a World War II relic. Again, they had to improvise a lot to keep their equipment flying. The Count returns to Sweden where he buys 5 planes, or 6 according to other sources, 2-seater basic training MFI-9 on which French technicians mounted rocket launchers and optical sights. With these humble machines with a 100 horsepower engine, he does something that shocks everyone, friends and foes alike. After training several local pilots and conducting test flights, they left. Generally the number is around 20 or so, among them Il-28 tactical bombers, MiG-17 fighters, C-47 Dakota and DC-6 transports. But that's not all. Several airports were also hit, many anti-aircraft batteries destroyed, a large number of vehicles and over 300 soldiers, some killed, some wounded, and not losing a single plane despite the constant fire to which they were exposed. But the most important part was in distracting the Nigerian Air Force from its genocidal targets and thus saving thousands of lives. Talking about cost-benefit, they were out of this world. In spite of the best efforts of Biafran Air Force and von Rosen's motley crew, unfortunately Biafra fails to defend itself and is occupied by the forces of Nigerian corrupt regime. Even von Rosen and his merry men couldn't make the final difference. At least they dealt a blow for liberty, for humanity, for honesty. After being evacuated from Biafra, he flew back to Africa on various food and medicine delivery flights, defying fate for years with countless bullets and shells missing him in the process. The Count will never be shot down. Luck in the air never left him at all. Unfortunately, luck turned its back on the ground. Karl, now 68, with a life behind him upon which volumes can be written about, von Rosen was killed in an attack by Somali troops on an auxiliary airport during the 1977 Ethiopian-Somali War, the last chapter of a drama in which he voluntarily, beyond all the cause and effect relationships of this world, achieved so much. He was not only a born nobleman but an eternal fighter for forgotten ideals, noble by creed and noble by deed. I hope you all liked episode 7 of this podcast. Thank you so kindly for listening and I will be back next time for episode 8 of the How Bizarre podcast. If you enjoyed this episode, please consider liking, sharing, and above all, subscribe to this channel, dear listener. Because, why not? Join me next time for another bizarre adventure through space and time. Cheerio.